Keith is a former heart patient. He's a patient research ambassador who's employed at the Liverpool Heart and Chest Hospital. He's extremely passionate about PPI. Many of you might have come across Keith along your own journey. And he's been supporting many research organizations and PPI groups for over 20 years. And he's just going to talk a little bit about what PPI really means for cardiovascular disease, clinical research, and also how you may wish to get involved. And he can really give a sort of a personal story and some case studies around that. So I'll hand over to Keith now.
Hello, everyone. So my name's Keith Wilson, obviously from the slides. I originally first got involved through a letter through a general appointment I had at the hospital to say that they were starting a patient group up. And the group was called the Shore Group. And the group was made up from different people from different backgrounds and, more importantly, different levels of education. I come from a non-medical background, which is important, and left school 2 years early and worked in a corner shop for many years because at the time I felt earning money was more important than getting an education. So I left school, went to work in a corner shop for 2 years, and I spent the rest 10, 11 years labouring jobs or manual jobs until I decided to use my benefits to open a market stall just outside of Liverpool, which I had for 20 years selling pet foods. Next slide, please. So all the work I'd done within the NHS had been on a voluntary basis. And then in 2012, I was asked, could I give a hand to help with a clinical trial called HEAT PPCI. What started as staying for 2 weeks ended up being a full-time salaried post. Next slide, please. So HEAT PPCI looked at 2 drugs that stopped the blood from clotting. And HEAT at the time was thought to be the largest ever single centre clinical trial in cardiovascular medicine. So I was given training, formal training in all aspects of the trial, from randomisation, data collection to follow-up. One of my main jobs was to meet the patients as they were brought in. I carried the bleep, I'd get information from them, and then I would go into the lab with them, decide what drug they were randomised to, and then tell the operator what drug to give them and what dosage to give them. Next slide, please. So the clinical trial, the results of the clinical trial were published in The Lancet in July 2014. And it was quite unique in many ways because it changed the guidelines for myocardial revascularization. And I'm sure Professor Stables will give you more details on that. And what was interesting was not sort of the outcome, but the 2 drugs that was compared. One was called bivalirudin and the other one was called heparin. And bivalirudin, both were in everyday use, but bivalirudin was £400 per vial. And if patients were over a certain weight, they may need 2 vials, which was £800. And the other drug that we compared it to, which there didn't seem to be much difference, was only 47 pence. That not only saved the trust who were doing 1,000 patients who fitted this criteria per year, it not only saved them approximately £500,000 a year, but it saved the NHS possibly upper tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds. Next slide, please. So then when the trial finished, which was around about April 2014, there was a discussion about what I was going to do next. So I said I would pack in and I would do voluntary work like I'd done over the many years before. People at the trust felt I shouldn't do that, and I'd shown a value within the clinical trial, and they said, we will try and find you some funding to keep you on in the post you were in. So then in May 2014, I became the first and only, I think up to now, patient to be full-time salaried within the NHS to do this formal role. So my role means that I represent patients' involvement in research. Because of my unique perspective, I can understand the complexities of a research trial now, but I can also understand the difficulties and vulnerabilities that patients may have or feel if they want to take part in a clinical trial. I try and help research staff to make sure the documentation is appropriate or the way we do the research, so the research fits the patient and patients don't have to change things to fit the research. But the most important thing for me is that I maintain the interests of participants or potential participants at all times. Next slide, please. So I work with researchers in companies on a local, on a national and a regional level. I liaise with research nurses and ward staff because for me, they're the people who have the most contact with patients or potential participants. And it's important for me to be involved at the very beginning of the clinical trial. It is so difficult to get people to change what they were planning to do when it's already set out. And I promote, and my role is to promote public and patients' involvement in research. And today is an example of what I may do on a regular basis. Some clinicians and academics first thought I was there to promote their research. I don't recommend clinical trials to anyone. I make research acceptable by making the documentation open and transparent. That's the only thing I do. Next slide, please. So most of the documentation that I see on a daily, if not daily, weekly basis is designed by clinicians or academics. And it's sad really because most of the people who look at it will not be clinicians or academics. That's why I want people like you who are on the call to try and get involved in research. And then again, you should be there at the beginning telling them what you think is appropriate and what you feel is feasible for people to take part. I again liaise with nursing staff and specialist staff if I need any advice. Next slide, please. So here's a couple of examples. If anyone's seen a patient's information sheet, they are normally standardized to a certain template. This is one I picked out because it was a classic example. So if you look at the title, which is the first thing you see, you will see codes PT10, PT33. If you look why you've been invited, you will see things like BHF, MDI. I didn't have a clue, but because it's my role, I persevered. And hallelujah, the information I needed to understand these codes was on page 4. So I had to read 3 pages of stuff I genuinely didn't understand. And when I got to page 4, I thought, what a fool, I need to go back. And it put me in a dilemma really, because either people will just not read it and not be bothered about research that may be valuable to them, or for me, even worse, they sign the informed consent to take part in a study. Next slide, please. Sometimes it's easy. This is for a cardiomyopathy researcher. He comes to me quite regular and we liaise with one another before he does the documentation. And this is just a simple example where I feel that the study title is complicated. And by adding a lay summary, not instead of, but in addition, that things may be a bit easier for potential participants to understand. Next slide, please. So what I do, or one of the things that I ask for, is a briefing paper. Now, a briefing paper is a document that is designed for a general audience. It's A4, single side maximum. If it's half a sheet, it's got to be a complicated study. And I expect it to be and ask for it to be in plain English. 2 simple words, plain English. And I've used the word English. It could be whatever language you choose to communicate in. And that is an addition to the patient's information sheet. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a briefing paper, and to save time, because I'm going to overrun anyway, I always do. If you could do the next slide for me. So these are some of the words, or all the words in that briefing paper that I did not understand. So either you would have an in-depth knowledge of your condition, and this is just a briefing paper, or you would spend an hour and a half on Google, which I had to do to work out the terminology. Next slide, please. So I worked with an investigator at the Trust, and we done this briefing paper. The original one back because I said it wasn't fit for purpose. The people who sent it to me said it was. I said it's not plain English. They said it is plain English. And then I realised it's plain English to the people who use that terminology every day, but not for the people I deal with, not to the people I see in Asda or Aldi in the queue. So I sat down and we designed this one. And what we did, anywhere there was an acronym, we said what it meant in the first instance. We tried to take the patient through a journey of the condition, what the condition's called, the symptoms, and then the possible solutions. That's all we do. And because this was research, on a separate paragraph, we put why the study was being done. Next slide, please. So I was speaking to someone and I was telling them about some of the issues I have, and he said, oh, that's Kahneman's law of least effort. I said, what's Kahneman's law of least effort? And he told me what it was. It says if there are several ways to reach the same goal, people will take the least demanding. And why not? Some of them have 2 or 3 jobs. Some of them aren't getting paid to do the research. They've got a family they want to go home to. But I also appreciate that people who are unwell often have problems with learning, memory, and thinking and comprehension. Next slide, please. Here's a classic example where all the information's there, but it's not in a format that could be easily understood. This was sent to me by one of my colleagues from another patient group at the Trust, and it was during the pandemic for COVID. And this was a sign that was supposed to tell people which way to go. And he emailed me, said, look at this. This is a classic example, isn't it, Keith? It would never happen at Liverpool Heart and Chest. I never answered him because I know it would unless we kept our eye on things. It's so easy. But it's just a classic example where all the information's there, but it's not in a format that most people can understand. Next slide, please. So why do I feel public and patient involvement is important? Well, many organisations require PPI before considering funding. Certainly the Department of Health do. And I believe having a link with public and patient members is a real asset. But as patients, we need an opportunity and support to build that relationship. We can't do it without that support. Next slide, please. I think that the importance of public and patients involvement means that we get clearer documentation. We get greater recruitment because people understand what they can expect from the research and what the research expects from them, and if that would improve any follow-up that was needed. But in general, I just believe that we get better research. Next slide, please. This is a picture that comes into my mind when I speak to people about research. I say to them, what do you know about research? They go, oh, don't mention it. I know nothing about research. But in fact, I think they do. Can I have the next slide, please? So I always say to them, I think we all do research, and they look at me blank. Well, I think we do. I think if we book holidays or car insurance online, I think it is research, but I think it's a similar type of research because it's a different set of questions, but we're still looking for similar outcomes. We're looking for the best possible treatment or experience at the cheapest possible price. So that's why I explained to them. So that's been a brief overview of the role I've been doing and hopefully doing in the future, and I hope it's been helpful. Next slide. So thanks everybody. The acknowledgements to the Levium Charitable Trust who partially fund my wages and have done for the last 12 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. That's a brilliant intro into it, and I think probably many of you on the call have sort of can what Keith has said resonates with. It certainly resonates with me. I'm not clinical, but I work with clinicians all the day, so you know the acronyms and everything. It can be difficult to wade through. So thank you so much. Really inspiring. So the next speaker, sort of moving along, so we have time for questions at the end, is Professor Rod Stables. So Professor Stables is an interventional cardiologist. He's also based at Liverpool Heart and Chest Hospital. But more importantly, he's the clinical lead and founder, really, of the BHF Clinical Research Collaborative. And so Rod's going to helpfully address some of the questions that I know some of our participants have already put forward ahead of this webinar, which we appreciate that. And also he's going to provide a clinician's perspective around involving patients in research. So over to you, Rod.
Right, thanks. Could I have the next slide? So the first thing I want to say is I'm really grateful to each and every one of you who's attended tonight, and we're very grateful for your interest. We hope this is the start of potentially a series of assets that we hope to provide, which would enthuse and inform and educate and interest and support you if you're able to make a bigger contribution to clinical research. Next slide. One of the questions that was submitted online, I just want to deal with it quite quickly in case it's bothering any of the participants tonight. And that is that it is true that we are UK focused, but we will support activity in each and every one of the UK home nations without prejudice. And that although some of our research is big enough or important enough that it may involve collaborators from other nations, we do tend to keep a UK force, but we do support Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, as well as England. Okay, next one. Now, what I've done is I looked at all of the questions that were submitted online, and I am going to do my best to provide straightforward answers to the themes that have been raised. Obviously, you're going to receive what are my opinions and based on my experience, and I suppose you'll understand that that's pretty much the only thing I can do. The only thing I would say, however, is that, as you can probably see for those whose eyes are good enough to look at the image on the screen, I am pretty old and I have been in the business for some time, so I've accumulated quite a bit of experience. I'm hoping, however, that I will flesh out some of the responses I'm giving you with some interesting real examples from the clinical research field. And the idea here is that you might find the experience, rather than just simple Q&A, to be something which is a little more engaging and with the aim of enthusing you, and also would perhaps provide a bit more stimulation for what we hope is going to be a buzzing open forum at the end of our session this evening. Now, I looked at the questions and some of them were very similar or overlapped. And so I've tended to group perhaps a number of individual questions into a theme and covered with one answer. And as a result, the exact wording of the way I pose the question may be similar, but not exactly match one that you personally submitted online. Okay, next slide. Now, it is true that a couple of the questions I've chosen not to address tonight, and that's because there were a couple of themes here. One or two of them were about a very highly specific clinical question about either a particular cardiovascular condition or a particular individual research question. And I just thought it wouldn't be fair to deal with this in a more general forum. However, for those people who are interested in those, if you email me directly, and my email is available on our website or is up on the screen there, I'm very happy to provide you some answers to those on a one-to-one basis. Another couple of questions were more about the way the NHS chooses to organise and deliver its care, rather than specifically related to clinical research. And I accept that these are really important issues. I accept that in the planning and provision of care, the views and opinions of patients are equally, if not more so, valid. However, it's a little bit outside the scope of what we do. Okay, so we go to the next slide. We can actually get on to talking about something now. So one of the big themes was that a number of participants asked questions along the line of, is really the PPA activity token? Do researchers take it seriously? Do clinicians regard it as an annoying tick box exercise that simply has to have a doffed cap at its creation? So I think we'd look at this a little more. Next slide. Now, doctors, they might have a lot of qualifications and they certainly did well at school, but they certainly do not necessarily know everything. And Steve Jobs said something years ago, which I think is really important, is that people don't know what they want until you show it to them. Certainly nobody really, no rank and file person foresaw the advent of digital music or songs on a phone or an audio book. And I certainly have learned an enormous amount by the very fact that colleagues, mainly Keith actually, just showed me the reality of what I was missing. I know it's a bit self-indulgent, but I was so pleased that Keith mentioned the heat trial. It was a wonderful experience for us. It was a relatively small team, perhaps only 6 or 7 people. We delivered a trial which a few years ago, 5 years ago now, on the 70th anniversary of the foundation of the NHS, the National Institute of Health Research, as a celebration of the 70th birthday, published on a website what they believed to be the 70 greatest research achievements in the history of the NHS. And heat PPCI was named. Just that year, it had been recorded as saving $700 million per year in US drug sales. And I was really delighted that a team, a disparate team, 3 doctors, 2 nurses, a secretary, Keith as our patient advocate, a retired clinician on our ill health, came together. And we worked well because we were disparate. We all brought a different perspective. We all brought something to the table that the other didn't have. And I think that's really important. Next slide. So what I've observed, and a couple of examples here, I mean, Keith's given you some good ones, but I've watched PPI involvement have substantial impact, not only in my trials, but in other people's trials. So let's look at some big themes. When a trial is pitched, people are usually asked to accept a random chance allocation between 2 treatments, or sometimes a treatment and no treatment at all. And the desire of the doctor to crack on with the science and further their career sometimes drives designs which are not really reasonable or practicable. They ask too much. And if patients do not buy into your study, it will fail. It will fail either in its initial recruitment or the subsequent involvement of patients and the ability to ascertain the downstream outcomes. Even if the basic concept is acceptable, we have to think about what the trial demands. Are the treatments comparable and reasonable? And would it be acceptable for a person to contemplate the possibility that they could receive either A or B, and that they would be happy with whichever popped up? We have to think about the demands of the process we impose upon them. Are we being ridiculous in asking perhaps an elderly or infirm population to visit the hospital multiple times for multiple tests? How will this actually take place in the practicalities of their lives? We have to think about what we're going to do with the information that they so kindly provide, either about themselves or about their condition, or sometimes even these days about results of blood tests or genetic material. Can they be assured that it will be held securely? Do they know that it won't subsequently be used for other purposes of which they're currently unaware or shared outside their initial consent? All of this is really important in the design. I'm also really interested in, are the research processes workable? Keith will know, because over the years I've had what I've called fantastic ideas. I've pitched to him and he said, oh, that's ridiculous, that won't work. And you think, oh yes, it will, that'll be fine. And the most notorious one, which I'm surprised Keith spared me from in his presentation today, is that I thought I might check on the vital status of the patient by asking them at 28 days to pop a postcard in the post, merely recording that they were still alive, which of course isn't such a great plan, but you need to see other people's perspective to get that. I think Keith has done a good job in talking about documentation, communication, understandability, so I won't go into that further. Next slide. Now, we've spoken here about the basics of the design, but also trials hinge on what are called outcome measures, sometimes called endpoints. But basically, the outcome measure is what specifically is the thing that you are measuring by which you will compare the success of the competing treatments. And we need to think about being clever about the outcome measures we use. Next slide. So in this, we've come to realize that doctors do not always make the best choices, or sometimes they make a reasonable choice, but they neglect other outcome measures that could be used or considered. And here we're talking about things that matter to patients. So when I was at medical school, a very, very long time ago in the 1980s, there was a textbook example about the treatment of elderly men with prostate problems. And doctors would design trials which would measure how fast you could urinate or how many times you got up at night to have a wee, and things which were related to your prostate and were obviously symptoms which bother patients. And the trial might report a certain surgical procedure had dramatic success in these domains, but it failed to report that it created complete, devastating, lifelong, irreversible impotence for the patients. And when the patients were privately consulted, they said, frankly, it's no consolation to me that I get up 4 times a night instead of 5 times a night. I would rather go the other way and keep other aspects of my biological function. And these things can get lost. Next. In addition to what exactly are the outcome measures, I'm also interested in who decides, who judges, who scores what the result actually is in each individual patient. Now, the answer to that question is usually it is what I'm going to call a clinician. I was tempted to say doctor, but often it's actually other health professionals like research nurses or other research staff who will chat to a patient, speak to them about the issues, and then they tend to record the judgment, often numerical. And this misses an opportunity for patients to actually privately and without pressure from the researchers interact with a form, either paper or online, put it in an envelope, slip it away, such that their views can be recorded directly from their own mouths. And as a little example about that, another piece of work that Keith helped with, performed by another member of our HEAT staff, who was originally by profession a nurse, who did his PhD with us. We were looking at the way clinical trials report the results of angina. People with narrowings in their heart arteries suffer chest discomfort. And a paper was written, which was published, and it compared the reporting of how bad the symptoms were before and after revascularization in a trial by doctors and the patients themselves. And this was a really interesting trial because Clinicians made the judgment which was reported in the academic paper, but as a separate part of the trial, we included a range of patient-completed questionnaires which gave the personal insight. And there were some really, really interesting results. Interesting results that would undermine your faith in the main reports of the trial published in the Lancet. Next slide. Now, this gets a bit complex, so I'll try to keep it simple. Basically, the angina is scored on a scale where 0 is no angina, 1 is a little bit of angina, and 4 is an enormous amount of angina. Now, what this scale at the bottom does is it looks at what the doctor said and what the patient says, and it subtracts them. So if the answer is 0, they both said the same thing. For the numbers which go to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, the doctor is suggesting the patient has more angina than the patient is. And the numbers that go to the left, which are negative, the doctor is suggesting the patient has less angina than the patient says. Now, this is at the start of the trial, at the baseline, before anything's happened. And you will see that although there is some variation, the variation is what you might call balanced, with a little bit more and a little bit less. If we look, however, at the end of the trial, and before I go to the slide, I want to say to you, at the end of the trial, of course, the doctor will have done the procedure. They will have some emotional requirement to believe that all of their work has been valuable. So let's look at the exact same diagram at follow-up at 6 months and 12 months. Next slide. Now you will find that it looks totally different. Almost always, the doctors suggest that the patient is having less angina than the patient reports on their own. And if you go to the next slide, if we just look at a really simple thing and easy to understand, what proportion of patients are reported as being completely free of angina? Doctors report between 20 and 25% of the entire population to be angina free, when the patient themselves says that they're not. Now, this is not some marginal difference. This is enough to sway the whole results of the trial. And this is another developing field. And it's interesting because I believe that the role of the patient and the patient voice and the patient advocate goes from concept to planning to delivery to conduct, but then through to reporting. Next slide. Right, here's another question. Are results usually shared with the study participants? Now, you would think that this would be obvious, vital, almost, I would say, a requirement, but sadly, it usually isn't the case. And study participants are often just effectively kept in the dark. And I think it's nice if trials in the future create a contract, a deal with the patients, whereby they will communicate the results, assuming the patient consents to that at the time of the consent. And we've been doing a lot of work on that. So next slide. In one of our trials conducted recently called the ARCH trial, we were looking at ways of communicating the information, and we were creating an infographic where in a relatively simple way, you can communicate the results and send them out to all of the patients. And I think this is another interesting field. Okay, next slide. Right, this is the next real domain of the questions. A number of people asked, how is the PPI opinion used in the grant application process? Now, obviously, there are many different grant systems and many different grant giving bodies, and I'm going to have to try to focus on just one as an example. So next slide. If I tell you what happens to the British Heart Foundation, it is true, as Keith said, that almost every major funding body now insists on some evidence of PPI engagement. But the BHF, for the major clinical studies, will lay out in the application form a number of specific questions covering a variety of domains. All the applications are reviewed by, I've said several, the answer is between 3 and 5 different members of their volunteer PPI team, each of whom provides written comments. All 5 of them discuss their views and review each other's comments. And at the formal subsequent committee meeting, 2 of the 5 are physically present as leads to represent the consolidated view. And their views are an agenda item in the discussion of each and every project. Now, to give you an idea what I'm talking about, Keith and I have been involved in a recent application to the BHF Innovation Fund, and last week we received our PPI comments. And I'm not going to tell you what the comments were. They were extremely helpful and insightful, but next slide will show you the headings that they were listed under. So, please use your space to try to summarize the most important points raised by the reviewers. This is the summary consensus. What must they focus on in their rebuttal? But then, in addition, the lay summary, is it clear? Is it needed? How it will be delivered? How important do you think the proposed program will be to those affected? Does the application demonstrate good involvement to date? Do you think the design will enable people to participate? Do you have any other general comments? So I think nowadays we're seeing much more focus on top quality engagement here. Next. Okay. Next, I think the next one should come up. Right. Another theme which came up was about what are we doing as a community to widen participation in PPI, not only in terms of making it happen in quality, but also perhaps seeking to engage minority groups or marginalized groups, or those who haven't been involved, or whose type and group are underrepresented in clinical research. And there may be, somebody raised a question which I think is relevant, which is that we often focus on drug trials because they're easy to describe, but how does this extend to trials of devices like pacemakers or surgical procedures, and how does it work in public health research? Now, obviously, this is a massive question, and I can only tell you what little bits we're doing. Next slide. Now, I think the whole community is beginning to wake up to recognize the value, and people are more embedding it, as we've discussed. We've worked with UK patient groups and support groups and societies dedicated to particular conditions to invite people to join us and identify the next generation. We seek to connect researchers to motivated volunteers like yourself, and you're all here presumably because you've registered on our national database, where we've tried to provide an environment for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, about your links or associations with hospitals, to talk about the disease conditions where you've perhaps got the greatest knowledge, interest, or personal lived experience. And this will allow us to make better matching. We have, for example, run a couple of studies where investigators have asked us for a wide range of patients who would wish to provide advice on a particular field. We've been able to run it against the database, come up with a broad spectrum of names representing quite a variety of ages, geographical distributions. And of course, all of these patients have consented to have that information passed on. And 3 or 4 times, even in these early phases, that's worked well. We're also interested in exploring new concepts, about looking about what is out there, what is trending on Twitter and social media, just to see what the buzz from the bees of. Now, obviously, this is not personalized to any one person's opinion, but is a way of keeping the temperature of what's happening in the general community. Next. So I think there's a lot has been achieved, but there's even more to do. And that's why we're all here tonight. And hopefully, some of you may wish to and choose to begin a journey to get involved, and we hope we can help with that.